Durante sus 10 años como bibliotecario en The Claremont College, trabajó como bibliotecario referencista en recursos electrónicos científicos, director interino de tecnologías de la información, jefe de colecciones y adquisiciones y finalmente como director interino de la biblioteca. Actualmente funge como Program Manager de Statewide California Electronic Library Consortium, posición que le da la oportunidad de trabajar en bibliotecas, editores y consorcios para aumentar la equidad de los precios y mejorar los productos. Jason Prise cuenta con una serie de publicaciones sobre el uso, descubrimiento y acceso a recursos electrónicos desde 2005. Bueno, vamos ahora a iniciar. Yo quisiera saber a qué horas duerme con tanta actividad, pero bueno, ya él nos lo platicará, ¿no? Va a ser en inglés la presentación, ¿me comentaban? Bueno, si alguien necesita un traductor, un aparatito para apoyarse, aquí a la vuelta hay, ¿no? Y si no, bueno, pues vamos a dar inicio en el uso de la palabra a Jason. Por favor.
Thank you. So, I'm sorry to let you know that Luis had a family emergency and so could not be here today. So if you were expecting to see him, you probably figured out that's not me. I have done my slides in Spanish. All of the notes are in Spanish. And I don't know if I assume there is I've been told there will be a translation available. If you need to go, maybe, I don't know if people are going to go get translators and come back. We could wait a minute or two. Yes? Okay, I will do that. So on Friday, I got a call. Help! We need someone to speak. Oh, and in Spanish, or to a Spanish audience. Spanish-speaking audience, I should say. Paso como 3 meses en Chiapas en 1991 y puedo hablar en español un poquito y entiendo un poco más, pero eso es el total de la español para este día para mí.
¿Vive en California?
Sí, en California, en Los Ángeles. Pero pasé 20 años desde yo hablo en español. Okay. All right, I will start slow, and I'll try to stay slow. So if you're trying to pick up my English, you can do so. So about me, I started full-time, just started full-time at a consortium after 10 years in a library. I worked in a consortium as a consultant, so they opened the door and let me in on occasion for the last 7 years. So I know a fair amount about the consortium and how it works, even though I've only been working there full-time for a short time. I think I have a pretty balanced perspective on libraries and consortia and how they work together. I also am happy to speak to this audience because of my background as a scientist. The resources are all science resources. So as a librarian who's served a broad set of subjects, arts and humanities, social sciences, these are the resources that the consortium is focusing on are the ones that are nearest and dearest to my heart as a researcher in biology. But I've taken those skills that I learned in school and applied them to library data, to trying to understand libraries and how libraries can do what they do more effectively. So this is a link to, This is a link to just to Mendeley. I think you can just search on Mendeley and find me. And some of the papers and many more that I've done are available there. Okay, about the consortium that I work for called SCELC. It's a bit smaller than yours and quite a bit older. It was founded in 1986. And we have about 180 member libraries in California and Texas, and about 134 affiliates all across the United States. So 200 or so institutions. And we license a lot of resources. So 2,600 from 120 different vendors. So I think your consortium, having just listened to the last presentation, is in the beginning of its trajectory. We can look back and I can share some of the experience in ours, which went from the same number that you're working with now in about 2004 really is when our electronic resource licensing began to take off. And we are now licensing for 33 million and thousands of electronic resources, and are about the 4th largest consortium in the United States, so relatively large. So one of the great consortia? Maybe. Más o menos. So I don't know if you're familiar with the graph, but this is supposed to remind you of something. I'll show you that graph in a minute. But this is the history of the licensing increase from year to year in the consortium and SCELC since 2004. So as you can see, our increases were 10, 40, 20, 40%. Many, many increases, or large increases year to year in the beginning. So this is the change in the percent over time. And then the blue line is the change in the percent in my library's budget, the library I worked in for the last 10 years. So as you can see, the proportion of our budget that's going to licensing these resources is a lot greater than it used to be because our budget stays flat and the consortium licensing and the amount we've licensed through the consortium has really increased a whole lot in a pretty rapid period of time. So here's the graph it's supposed to remind you of. I don't know how many have seen this before? Okay, it's not familiar. So this graph is to describe the change in pricing of journals since 1986, and it's made by the biggest libraries across the country in the United States, and they show massive increases in prices. Probably increases in prices of journals aren't surprising to you. We know that there's just been very large increases in the costs. And so here are the increases in how much we spend on books. And in fact, to some degree, the number of books we're able to buy and the number of journals we're able to buy stays flat or decreases over time. So this image, this graph, is the icon of what they call the serials crisis, the crisis of the fact that the costs go up a lot faster than our budgets do. And to some degree, consortia are a response to this, although when I put this together, it made me think it almost looks like the consortia are participating in this, and in some ways, I suppose they are. But I would say this is not a crisis of consortium. Ojalá que no, no puede ser, no. This is a response to that increase in pricing that we've seen historically. How do libraries deal with the fact that prices are going up faster than they can afford? They band together, and that's what a consortium is, right? A consortium comes together. And so our consortium has been successful actually in representing very small libraries as well as large ones. So I understand that's an issue within your consortium as well. We have 10 or 20 large institutions, and then we have dozens and dozens of very small ones. And part of this licensing is licensing to them at a cost they can afford. So in fact, the executive director of our consortium comes from a library with only 15 or 20 faculty and a few hundred students. And so this is part of the reason why we do what we do, is to serve small institutions. So the topic that I figured out I was going to try and talk to you about a few days ago is the role of the librarian in the midst of this. And so if you think of this as the consortium and this is a representation of a librarian, you might think, well, the consortium is getting bigger and pushing the librarian out. Well, we hope that that's not the case. Yet another way to think of that is that the role, another possibility is that the role of librarians might be shrinking. But I would say actually that the role of librarians is growing and that consortia are fading into the background. So this is far ahead of where you are now, but I think it is the ideal because what librarians can and should be involved with is making sure that users are able to get to information, not having to constantly spend all their time negotiating with publishers to try and afford to deal with limited budgets. And in fact, there is a trend in the US in this same direction for consortia to be dealing with that, and hopefully for the broadest community possible to have access to the information, but and allowing librarians to focus on different things. So at the end I'll get to some of those, although I wanted to stick to the traditional role of librarians and how, even though it's changing because of consortia, there are still things closely related to the collections role of librarians that we should be involved in. So in general, here are some themes for my talk. Consortia are a response to technological change and change in the environment. They're not causing it, they're there because we needed to react to it as a library community. I would say consortial collections require more collaboration than ever before. We need, as libraries, to tell the consortia what we want and what we need. And the consortia and libraries need to help support this management of such a greater number of resources. So before, when we didn't have very many resources, we could kind of keep track of them. But now that we have many, many more subscriptions and journals and access to try to track and provide access to, it's more than a single library can handle. So I make a plea, which I make to libraries in California as well, to find ways to work together. And I think that was a theme of the previous presentation as well. To some extent, consortia enable libraries to focus more on broad access and less on local collections, and should enable libraries to focus more on service and less on collections. And certainly this is not good news to some. Some who really like to manage collections have to find different ways to do that. And there is still plenty to do at the local library for these things. I was reminded of that in the earlier talk. I think one of the things a library can do is look at turnaway data. So there are counter journal reports that say, that you can get from a publisher that says how many times are my users trying to use things that I don't have access to. If you use that data and you present that data to someone at the consortium, it can help to guide them in the directions that you want them to go. But ultimately, the problem you have here, for maybe somewhat different reasons, is the same problem that we have in the United States, which is that we have lots of users using lots of expensive content that they have no idea libraries are paying for. And so if users don't know either how to get to that content and use that content, or if they use it and don't know it's coming from our budgets, how are our budgets, whether it's one big overarching budget or whether it's piece budgets institution by institution, how are administrators going to continue to fund those budgets appropriately if we don't know, if they don't know, if their users aren't saying, oh yeah, that library, they're really important to me. Instead, it's who needs the library, right? And so that battle is a battle the consortium cannot fight for you. There are many battles which the consortium can fight for you, and I think it's good that they're doing that, and it's working out well. We, though, Wow, I'm getting chills. I'm excited. So it's crucial that libraries work directly with users to make sure they understand how to use our resources and the value of the funding that is going into providing those resources to them. And I see Consortium as enabling that. Okay, so the main outline of the main talk. I want to talk about 4 areas. I'll give you a couple of examples. Some apply more, maybe some less, but I will do my best. So I want to talk about value, and that value now coming from breadth instead of quality. I want to talk about price negotiation, and that being more related to packaged collections than individual titles. Then I want to talk about access management and managing that at the level of the package rather than the title. And then finally, licensing and preservation as a group, as a group of libraries, as a consortium rather than individually, and the benefits of that. So when the first inkling I got of what this talk was about on Friday afternoon was that it was about the big deal and the effect that the big deal had on libraries and what the librarian's role was before and after the big deal. When I say big deal, how many know what I mean? Okay, good. I will tell you. So the big deal was basically a change in strategy for licensing journals, which publishers came upon when they realized that trying to expand access and manage access to a different journal collection for every single library was not going to be cost effective. Instead, they said, as long as we can continue to keep the revenue for the number of titles you're subscribing to now, it's going to be better for us and better for you if we open up our collections and say, if you make a commitment to maintain your subscription spend, then we'll give you access to all of these other titles. Huge collections of journals, right? So whereas even the largest libraries only ever had maybe 30 or 40% of titles from a publisher as subscriptions, since the big deal has come around, even the smallest libraries now have access to most, if not all, of the titles from a publisher's collection. And that big deal has advantages and disadvantages. Advantages of broader access are clear. And I'll talk a little bit about cost and the value of the dollars that we spend. But it has its disadvantages too. So just as a quick history of the bundling of journals, and that's what the big deal does, right? It bundles journals together, so we don't manage individual subscriptions, we have to manage packages. And consortia effectively license for those packages. And big deals are a big part of what most consortia do. So the first electronic journal was published in 1987. They began to talk about this serials crisis I mentioned before and the costs going up starting in 1990. Apparently at the Frankfurt Book Fair in 1993, a publisher envisioned this grouping of journals and said, boy, we need to solve this problem. Maybe we can solve it with something like a big deal. Then this big deal, this Gran Cosa, was first signed, the first one in 1996. That graphic I showed you with the massively increasing prices of journals came out in 2000, and still big deals began to be signed by more and more libraries in the decade of the 2000s, and are still more are coming on today. So the challenge of the big deal is that you commit to maintain spending on the set of titles, the amount of titles that you have every year going forward with a particular increase. And you can't say, okay, I don't want those 10 journals anymore, so can I have a reduction in price? It's basically not part of the deal. If you do that, you fall out of the deal. Now, since you have a consortium that's licensing these big deals for you, that may be somewhat less of a concern, although it is still the challenge of theirs to stay within the budget that they have and that they can get approved by their funding sources. And so dealing with these big deals is a big part of what consortia do. So the value before the big deal in terms of our money as it was spent on journals, most titles were not available. We had subscriptions to a few, and we didn't have access to any of the others. The cost per use was very high because we had to pay the full price for each one of those journals. You know, $500, $1,000, $2,000, $10,000, huge amounts. So what the big deal did is it gave us access to many, many more titles at a fraction of their cost. So this is the cost per use, and this is an example, sort of a before the big deal example. My library before this big deal had 192 titles, and we paid almost $30 per article that we downloaded from those subscribed titles. Then, though, we were able to add to that big deal by adding a big set of additional journals at a very low cost. So our cost per use for those was much lower because when you add all those other titles, you pay only a very small additional fee, if any. And so then that brought us down when we looked at the expanded collection from about 200 journals to about 500 or more. The cost per use goes down. So this tends to happen. You provide broader access, people use the resources more, and the cost per use goes down. So one argues then, well, especially if one is a publisher, that the big deal is a great deal, and for many libraries it is as well. You end up with a much lower cost per use. You can get access to 10 to 100 times more titles from a publisher, depending on how many you might have started with. But the cost does continue to increase each year, and even though the percentage increase is lower than that graph we saw where that was going up 7% a year or so, there's still an increase each year that tends to be higher than the budget of the libraries. So we also have to continue to do journal cancellations. I don't know if this is a part of your experience in your history, but it is of mine. As an individual librarian, my role was to have to review those titles and figure out which ones we could cancel because we couldn't afford to keep all of them anymore. So many individual subscriptions, both high and low cost titles, and decisions are difficult. They always are when you're removing resources. But maybe the cancellations can have smaller effect because you can just pick a few of the titles that are used the least and let them go. Now, though, after this big deal, the libraries have few individual subscriptions. So you can kind of also envision this as the role of managing a collection in one of your libraries. As the consortial collections grow and you have less and less local funding for resources that you license that you don't get through the consortium, it gets harder and harder to adjust things because a large amount of the money is spent elsewhere. So you have, after the big deal, you have only a few individual subscriptions. Most are lower cost, and decisions are even more difficult than they were when you had more titles. And the cancellations may have a bigger effect because at some point you're only subscribing to the stuff you really need, and you've got to deal with that. So the advantage, of course, is that consortia have more power when negotiating on behalf of many libraries, but there are still certainly limitations. So a couple of opportunities. One, something that I did a while back, which I think your consortia could potentially do, to create a custom shared collection. So we decided rather than managing our individual titles separately, we would look at which titles each library was using and remove those titles that no one was using very much, and there were a surprising number that no one was using very much, and thereby manage the costs. So this is kind of a complicated graph, but This is usage from quite a while ago, but it's 1 year of usage, and each different color dot is a different library. What I want to point out is that this is the number of titles ordered by use for each library, and these long lines represent the number of journals that were not used at all by that individual library. So all of these, each one of these dots, which you can't see because they're all overlapping, represents a journal title. So this is 100 journals or so that library didn't use any of. Here's another 100 journals that this library didn't use any of. And you might think that every library uses different journals. In this case, that was not the case. The best journals are used by most libraries because they have the content, that they have the high reputation, and so faculty are more likely to use them. So we were able to look at that usage, pool the titles that were used most by particular, by the broadest set of libraries, and shrink the cost and increase the number of journals that were of interest and used. So moving on from costs and price, I want to talk a little bit about access. Before the big deal, we had fewer titles to manage. Most titles, I mean, few titles were, and even those few titles were often not available to most libraries. We added titles to the catalog, we tracked them individually, each library had to manage it on its own, and then the role of the librarian was to maintain their own title list. They said, here are the things we have access to. If you search our catalog or you check our title list, here are the things we have. But what we find is that now that we have these big collections, our lists of the big collections are really inaccurate. We were able to manage the few titles that we had accurately. Now we have a much bigger challenge. So there's basically two kinds of errors at the title level and the reason. So here's a false positive error, including links to things that aren't accessible. Here's the other kind of problem, false negatives, not including links to things that are accessible. This is how do the users find the content. It's based on these lists. If these lists are inaccurate, folks can't find the content. So sometimes the access to the title we should have wasn't activated by the publisher. Other times there were things that were activated by the publisher that we just didn't know we had. Sometimes the number of years are overrepresented, so we say we had more than we actually had, or the editor or the publisher said didn't activate something we were supposed to have. The alternative case where we're not showing everything that we do have is when we underrepresent what we list. This is a big job because if you have a list of 800 journals that change names and have different years and are changing year to year as journals change from publisher to publisher, to try to track even the journals for the 30 or 40 collections that you now have as a consortium would be too much for any one library to do. Furthermore, if every individual library did it, you would be duplicating effort massively because you should all have the same list of titles accessible, right? So this is a call to work together. So here's just some numbers to sort of show those problems, how common they are. So, and I did that. I animated this. Well, I guess that was so I can remember. Okay, so over-reported access dates out of a collection of about 1,400 journals. There were 31. Titles not listed, 85 were left off the list entirely. Other titles that we couldn't really tell whether they were right or not because the dates of the accessibility was variable was 59. Others, the title change wasn't reported, so if someone tried to link to a title and they knew they needed this journal in this year, they couldn't find that journal. Other cases, underreported access, so we're not saying we have access to things we actually have. And then most still were correct. But this means that, 16% of the access that we're supposed to be listing and providing access to this content isn't accurate. And the problem is that these lists change all the time. And if every single library tries to track the same collections, you run out of steam. You can't keep up with it, and it's really difficult to do. So what I've recommended is actually having different folks within the consortium focus on particular lists, share that back with the consortium, and then make sure that the lists are provided to everyone else. So we have many more titles to manage. They're available to many more libraries' researchers. This is a good thing, but we want to make sure they can find them. Now our packages are listed in a knowledge base rather than the catalog, and ideally libraries can share management. So the role of the librarian here is to check the lists and correct them as necessary, and then share those lists with other libraries so that when a researcher uses an access tool, they're going to find that content. Okay. Another opportunity that's related to consortium and licensing through consortium is that before consortia, licenses differed for every library, right? Yeah? Okay. Different for every library. And then it was extremely difficult for publishers to respond to library requests to make improvements, given that one library had this term, this other library had this other term. Everybody was pulling in different directions, and the publisher said, well, we can't do this. We can't do all these different things you're asking for. Now that the library, the licensing is happening through the consortium, the power of the negotiation power can create change. So when many libraries have the same license terms, they can work together to preserve shared rights and content. And this I heard as one of the goals of your consortium, making sure that the content that is purchased and the money that is spent goes to things that you have permanent access to, that you know exactly what it is, and that you have access to it permanently. So there's sort of two opportunities here. One is maintaining annual titles rights lists. So each year, the titles that you buy from a publisher change. Each year, that list is important, and it's important that you have a permanent record of that list so that if in the future you no longer participate in that deal, you still have access to that content, because we are buying access to this content each year in the same way that we bought print journals before. So one opportunity, the second opportunity is to actually use those lists to create an independent digital archive for all. So I hope the translations aren't too far off. I did my best. But locks, lots of copies keep stuff safe, is now moving toward having governments, actually countries, have 6 to 10 representatives who preserve the content separate from the publisher, separate computer, separately controlled, but that they're working on having that content preserved and then available to whoever might need it in the future. So it's not the case that every individual library has to do it, but this is something that can be done by the larger libraries on behalf of the whole. And LOCKSS is slowly moving in this direction, and I encourage you to take a look. Okay, so are the consortia all powerful? Well, no, not all powerful. Yes, maybe more powerful than individual libraries, but in most cases that's a good thing. But no, because the consortium still has to work on behalf of its members. It has to it can come to the door, but it can't go through it, right? It has to do the things that you need it to do. And ultimately, publishers still set the price. We are partnering with the publishers because they want to make their content affordable. They're most looking to make a profit as well, but if their content isn't affordable, then they're not going to make any profit because we're not going to buy it. So it's a collaboration. There is definitely increasing centralization of collection management that happens with a consortia. And some view that as a bad thing. In general, as long as it provides greater access to users that we don't have to worry as much about, I see it as a good thing. And again, there is centralization of some of those roles. So licensing, acquisition, collection management are tending to move away from libraries. But totally apart from consortia, this librarian from Harvard said the following in 2009. Libraries will increasingly work to identify and describe information they will never own, and to provide the tools that enable their students and scholars to discover and use those resources effectively. Never own, which for some place like Harvard, which is has a virtually unlimited budget and is about owning everything, is really beginning to say something. They're realizing that it's not possible anymore to even hope to own all or even the most important of the information that's out there for our researchers. The alternative is to focus on access over ownership. And so in some ways, if consortia can allow you to do that and to make sure that you're enabling your users to access the content and you don't have to worry as much about whether you own it, how you own it, whether you can still afford it, that could be a really good thing. So we have to remember, and when we think about this, the context we're in, the situation of our users is changing as well, right? They went from not enough information, in some cases none, I guess, to way too much information, at least as they grow these big deals and as those become available to everyone within an IP range. They now have more stuff than they know what to do with. They went from not being able to find anything to not being able to find the right thing or the best thing. I mean, the digital age, Google and all, are going from not knowing how to find information, now they can find it, but they don't know how to use it. And so fundamentally, I see the role of librarians as being, growing into, expanding into, helping users know how to use that information, how to get it, and how to use it. So this perhaps should have been the rest of my talk, but this is I'll take a few minutes in each one. So, as the consortia begins to take a greater role on the management of collections, what should libraries do instead? What should librarians do instead? So some are directly related to that. Offer support for consortial collection development efforts. There are lots of things you can do by looking at your local data to help them make good decisions. So if you're interested in data and you liked collection management, even though you don't necessarily directly control what you purchase, you can still give feedback on what your users want and what your users need. And you can do that based on the data that you have. And it's really crucial that you advocate for the content that you or your users need. So that's something I've seen from the position of the consortia over the last 7 years. When a library asks, when 1 or 2 or 3 libraries ask, we listen. And so there is a collaborative relationship. We can, there's lots of stuff out there. What do your users want? You are our connection to your users. And the consortium cannot serve them without understanding from you about them and without you knowing a lot about them. So third, optimize your discovery tool, even if it's Google Scholar. And I did hear in the presentation before, it sounds like they're contracting for that discovery tool. Discovery tool is a way to bring together all of the resources into a single place. It's not really a browser. It's a platform of sorts. It's really a search tool that makes sure everything that the library licenses is searched effectively, which Google will search some stuff more effectively than others, and other stuff not at all, which we're licensing. So the discovery tool's role is to try to be as effective as Google and even more effective than Google in providing access to some of the things that we license, which users otherwise wouldn't find. So there's a whole huge set of things that can be done related to that, making sure that it's working well, making sure that the linking is working well. This is an area that libraries could do to put more time into, because again, we need to show the return on the investment of our budgets. We need to make sure that the money that is being spent shows value. And discovery tools that enable a user to find what they want, users get very excited when they find what they want and they talk about it. And if we can record that and share that with our funders, then that helps us to be effective. This is one to think about too, and ensure that content and downloads are branded. I don't know how well that translated, but basically, you know, do the users know where they got their information? If there's a big watermark on the side of the PDF that says downloaded from X library, then they're going to know, at least if they print out the paper, the article, where it came from. You can also make sure that working with the publishers, that your institution's logo shows up on those pages that come up from Springer or Elsevier or Cambridge or wherever they may come from. Again, being where the users are, making sure they know that content or has an increased chance of knowing that that content is coming from the library. These last two are things that are more of a stretch, but I think they're things that we really need to be doing. Partner with faculty to design assignments to teach students, not just how to find stuff, not just how to use a database, but how to cite, how to write, and how to search. So I think I have a little time. I'll tell you a story. So as a biologist, I came in and I started in the library, and they told me to give a tour of the library to the incoming students. And this was about the time when the students were beginning to use most things from Google and didn't want to try to figure out how to get from citation to citation in a print journal. And I could have fought them and said, well, you need to learn how to do this exactly the way that I know how to do it, so that then you're going to be able to do this that way. But I realized two things. One, they're going to have links that do that for them in a lot of cases. And two, when I read their papers and looked at their citations, I realized the problem wasn't that they couldn't find the information, but they didn't know how to read a paper and say, this is the main point, and this is an appropriate citing sentence related to this paper. It is ABCs, although it's complex, because how do you as an undergraduate student distill the information in a scientific paper into a sentence that is an appropriate sentence to cite from that paper? Yeah. And so it's something they have to learn, and faculty, and I can say this because I worked with a lot of them, tend to take that for granted. This is a skill, not just the structure of the citation, but the actual how to cite that we can help with. And that ultimately, even if those students don't go on to be scientists and researchers and graduate students, more and more this content is becoming available to them, right? There's more content available through open access. At some point in the future, they may have a family member who has some kind of ailment and they want to go and read about a disease or something else. Understanding what a citation is and what that sentence means could turn out to be really valuable there for them in the future. And so these are the things which, if you think about trying to do that for all students, it's an overwhelming task. Maybe it's a little less overwhelming if we don't have to manage all of our collections and spend as much time doing that. And then finally, spending time reaching out to faculty. Since they now, at least where I'm from, come to the library a lot less than they used to. They don't need to come there. They don't know the librarians. They're much less likely to see our value and know that we have things that we can help them with if we don't reach out to them. So we can't wait for them to come to us anymore. We kind of have to go and make ourselves available to them where they are. And again, this is a transformation of libraries, but I think it's not caused by consortia in any way. It may be to some degree enabled by them, and from my view of the libraries in the United States, there are major pressures on our budgets. The future of libraries is in question, and I think it will be much less in question if we manage to accomplish these things. And to some extent, if we leave the licensing to others, we have to build those relationships. We're the people who can do that as librarians on a campus because that's where we are and they are our people. Gracias por su atención amable.
Muchas gracias a Jason.